you can accomplish the same thing with both. It's just going to look a little different and have different characteristics. I mean, you can have a predictable Kanban team if you're delivering, within a predictable set of SLAs that are aligned to your actual cycle times. That is as reliable as a Scrum team that commits to a set of points every 2 weeks that's based upon yesterday's weather.
Hey, this is Dave Pryor. Welcome to Leading Agile's Sound Notes. So Tom Furland is here. Tom, thank you for making time this evening.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
And we're going to talk all about, I don't even know how to explain this topic. We're going to talk about Kanban. We're going to talk about what happens when you put in an enterprise and how things can get a little bit weird with the tracking of the work. And we're not coming down pro or con. It's more of an exploration, right?
Yep.
We would like people to consider these things when they're talking about how they're going to do it. So before we get into this topic, would you mind giving these folks a little bit of a rundown on who you are? I don't think we've done a podcast since we talked about Disney. So
it's been a while. But, yeah. I'm Tom Furland. I'm a managing consultant with Leading Agile. I've been with the company almost 5 years now. I help organizations implement change generally focused around how they bring Agile in various forms and flavors to their systems.
All right. Thank you. And I ran into a problem recently that I had to call and ask for Tom's help with because I have a client who is a big enterprise, tons of teams, most of them doing Scrum, but some of them doing Kanban, and trying to figure out how to track the work at the program and portfolio level seemed to me to be causing some issues. So since you ran into that problem first, would you mind kind of like walking through like the setup for it? Because you ran into it at another client.
Yeah, so I was working in a client that had they wanted to do Agile in a professional services context. So what that means is basically they would have standard offerings within the enterprise, but they had a unit within their company that was dedicated to customizing solutions that they were no longer off the shelf solutions to be able to fit the needs of various enterprise class customers that could not deal with just something off the shelf.
Yeah.
So for them to do that, they had a lot of their work was not necessarily development. It was the managing of things like, in many cases, like similar to what we do in consulting, of like managing statements of work and, the
administrative
intake.
stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So the intake of clients, the turning around of contracts, the weights and the bottlenecks and things that they have that in many cases they don't really have any control over because they're completely external to the company. So they wanted to go Agile, and it was pretty clear just, even looking at them from the surface level, that this was not going to be something where you can just go in and, kind of
install it and hope for the best.
Standard, like, hey, let's go teach them Scrum and let's see what happens. I mean, that would have been setting them up to fail pretty massively.
Okay.
Would have introduced a lot of pain into their system. So we decided pretty quickly that they were going to have more of a Kanban approach. So, really the emphasis there is, if you're not familiar with the difference, Kanban is, less of a prescriptive framework like Scrum is. Scrum, you have a Scrum guide that lays out roles, lays out, ceremonies, lays out cadences and artifacts and things like
time
that.
Boxes,
fairly prescriptively. Kanban is more of a, something that can be applied to a variety of different contexts. Did not come from the IT world at all. Has its, origins back in, the Toyota executives going and looking at how they stock supermarket shelves. So, it can really be applied to a lot of different domains, and the emphasis is on, just a few principles like measuring and managing flow, making your workflow visual, having explicit process policies, and things like that aren't terribly hard, but the devil is really in the details, and to go implement those things and to do it in a way where it's not just going to turn into a glorified state tracker that doesn't really improve anything.
Which happens more often than not.
Yeah, I mean, that is the biggest failure mode for teams that try to go Kanban because they don't want Scrum to work for them, or not because they don't want Scrum to work for them, but because Scrum is not going to work for them for whatever reason, is they decide to go Kanban, but there are constraints and disciplines around Kanban that they need to be cognizant of, and those are kind of hard to do. So many times they just kind of end up being, pushed off to the side when it becomes hard to move things forward.
So if you're doing Kanban and all you're doing is using it to move cards from like ready to doing to done, it's kind of like you bought a Ferrari and you're driving it at 25 miles an hour down the road.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you're not going to see any of the benefit that comes from, being able to actually identify where the constraints in your system are, subordinate your flow to your constraints, exploit those constraints, and begin to, limit your WIP and see throughput increases.
Yeah. So, all right. So now I want to talk about my client, because what I had was, this client has probably like 50 teams, and most of them are doing Scrum. And they wanted a way to track work across the teams and to compare teams at the program and portfolio level. So they implemented this system where they have like basically common states of work that the work is going to flow through, which is fine if you're doing Scrum, but not so fine if you've got like 10 teams that are doing Kanban. And one of the things that, I started working with some of these teams, and I'm like, okay, we have to do a value stream map. We have to understand the different states of work and all the different steps that the work flows through. And I learned that like in a particular column, there might be like 5 or 6 different states in that column. And that was super confusing for me. And I assumed for them. And I'm like, well, look, you're going to have to like, Kanban meets you where you are. You have to map out your workflow, understand how the stuff is moving, understand what things must be true before we move from one state to the next, and then track the flow and optimize the flow. But they're stuck in a thing where they can only use these certain columns.
Yeah. And you're really kind of dealing with a tension that you run into when you apply Kanban in an enterprise environment around, being able to hold true to the principle of, mapping out the workflow and visualizing the workflow, but within, the various ALM tools, whether you're talking about Jira or Azure DevOps or Rally or, version 1, whatever you're doing there, being able to actually administer all of those different workflows within the tool. So you kind of have this choose your hard situation there, where you either have to create the conditions such that you can delegate down the ability to administer things locally, and you have a whole bunch of different administrators and some complexity around permissioning and, layered logic going behind all of that, that, has its own issues when it comes to trying to make change or trying to, maintain or update those, or having to come up with some level of abstraction of the workflow that works for everybody.
Yeah. So you just brought up something I hadn't really thought about before. So I was so wrapped around the axle of coming to this with the intent of, I want this team to understand how they work. I want them to understand, how work is moving, where it's getting stuck. And I want them to take ownership of driving the change to help their system improve. So they become students, which to me is the whole point of this way of working. You become a student of your own way of working, and you work to optimize that. But they can't do that if they can't put in the states that the work is moving through. I hadn't even really considered the fact that they're using Jira. That would mean that they'd have to have their own Jira admin just for their team pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah. So the client that I was at actually had, because of the way that things were kind of emerging with Jira and the enterprise and the size of the area where things are working, we had the ability to do that kind of thing, to actually have some more localized permissions that were fairly limited and have the ability to upkeep it, because we weren't talking about, having to maintain this over, 50,000, 100,000 users, something like that,
right.
Or even, tens of thousands of users. We're talking, hundreds and, a handful of different work areas within this client. So for an area like this professional services, it might even make sense, even within a larger enterprise environment, to carve out an exception for them.
Mm-hmm.
But because they are just like so unique and within that enterprise, but you also can't carve out an exception for everybody.
Right. So in this case, it would be like an exception for 10 teams. And I'm also thinking, like, if I'm a business owner, 10 teams out of like 50, like, couldn't we just like let those teams twist and have a hard time with this? Because is it worth the business hassle of hiring a bunch of special admins just for these teams?
Yeah, it is a completely valid concern from a running a business standpoint, from a still needing to be profitable and to hit our margin targets and to hit our our hurdle rates and things like that, when we are operating in an environment with a lot of different teams sharing a lot of different resources. And it's not exclusive to Kanban, but Kanban does tend to expose it fairly well. We're seeing it at the client I'm at right now, with Scrum implementations, just around things like, well, how do you satisfy, everybody with having required fields, right?
Yeah.
Things like that. And, some of the layered logic around that. So, there are concerns that you have to balance. There are trade-offs that you have to make around the level of complexity you are willing to accept in your administrative setup.
Yeah.
And then, from there, you have to, figure out what are the things you can do now and what's kind of the path forward. And you can, articulate a bit of a tooling backlog to work some of those things out that, hey, maybe we can't do complex permissions now. Maybe we can do them a little bit down the road once we kind of get the basics stood up. So, there are ways to deal with it. It's just not necessarily easy nor immediate.
Yeah. So I want to kind of keep jumping back and forth, because to me, there's good if I focus on it from the team level, there's good, but that makes it hard for the business. So if I focus on it from the business level, that's good, but it makes it hard for the team. And I don't know if there's, I guess I feel like you kind of have to pick. This is my favorite child or this is my favorite child, because they can't both be my favorite child. It's not going to work. Right.
Well, it's not necessarily a right or wrong, but at the end of the day, you want to start with the end in mind of where is the design of your organization going?
What problem are we trying to fix?
Right. What are we trying to solve within our organization? We want to design our organization to be able to solve the problems that we're trying to solve for, our clients and our customers and internally. And to be able to do all of that, you then want to be able to reflect those communication channels in, your tooling.
Okay.
It's the whole Conway's Law aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
So, part of this is you design the tooling not for where you are, you design it for where you're going. So figure that out.
Okay.
Then based on that, what compromises are you willing to accept? What compromises are you willing to accept permanently? What compromises are you willing to make in the short term? And what compromises or what things do you think you're going to be able to fix, over time? And then, develop an actual strategy that goes along with your change strategy for your overall org.
Okay.
That enables you to kind of manage this tension.
Okay. So let's talk about from each side, like what perfect world. I'll try to do the team level and tell me what I'm missing. If I wanted to give this team like total autonomy and ownership over optimizing their own flow, they would be able to, let's assume they're not, for a second, they don't have Jira, it's just cards on a wall. So they can change stuff however they want, right? They map out the states of their own workflow. They start to track cycle time from one state to the next and lead time. They're tracking the validity of the conditions. I forget what the conditions that must be true to move from one state to the next.
Yeah, the exit policies.
Exit policies, thanks. So they're trying to tune that up, and they're just learning what their way of working is. And as they learn that, they start to see where there's bottlenecks and where WIP limits can help. But they have control over that. They can change it if they realize, hey, we need to break this thing in two, or have an escalation path, or change the WIP. They have full authority to do that.
Yeah, that is one of the great things about Kanban is it gives you the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions, very, very rapidly. And it doesn't necessarily constrain you with, a fairly arbitrary time box, right? You can set up to, I've used it in organizations where, Scrum wouldn't work for various reasons. And, like for instance, there was one organization that had such complexity of their underlying architecture that every time they did a software release, they'd have to do, a 2-week regression cycle. Well, that's not really going to work in a Scrum setting unless you just start, having these like non-value add sprints that you throw in there and you just accept that there's going to be no work done. I mean, you can compromise around that, or you can decide to, just say, okay, screw the Scrum thing in this situation. It's not going to work for us. The conditions don't exist.
Yep.
Let's map out a Kanban, figure out where our constraints are, and actually make some trade-offs around, okay, if we want to be able to move things faster, we've got to be able to like move more resources to the regression effort, stuff like that. And be able to actually see some movement there and start, measuring and manage flow, subordinating to constraints and seeing results. I've done it there. It can be useful in situations as simple as like my brother-in-law works for an electric company and wanted to be able to manage how he deploys, the electricians to different homes to work on, things like that, to understand, where do we have tickets that have been sitting for a while, get to this idea of, what's our lead time, and get an understanding of those kinds of things. I mean, it's applicable over so many contexts that it's, it's really kind of a wonderful thing. But, because of that flexibility, it's a double-edged sword. So perfect world, you would be able to map out your workflow, whatever that is, cards on a wall, whatever, map out your workflow, be able to identify, measure your flow between states, identify your constraints where things start to, where your cards start to pile up, WIP limit where those constraints are so that you're, not trying to feed more paper into a jammed printer, right? Identify your buffers, things like that, and measure and manage your flow out of your buffers and start to see some benefit from that. Start to be able to continuously improve and start to move your constraint up the stack.
Okay.
Right? Or accept it for what it is.
And in that model, the onus for improvement is placed on the team.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it's local autonomy there. Okay. Right? So that team is given in a perfect world where the team is, answers to itself. They have autonomy to do any of those things. But, much like Scrum Guide, you often don't find Scrum teams that are just answering and receiving backlogs from, a product owner, right? Okay.
So in a large organization like the one I'm working with now, they have all these teams, and I don't know if I doubt that the intent is to approach it this way, but there's I believe probably somewhere a perception that somebody needs to be watching over all the teams. so they can figure out which teams need to be fixed, which teams are performing, which ones aren't. How do we help them? How do we help the system make it easier for them to do their work? And that takes the onus away from the teams and places it in the hands of the people upstairs.
Well, yeah, I mean, there can be some of the Taylorism mindset in there of, somebody needing to manage the teams. But there's also, I mean, the very legitimate concern that, these teams aren't funding themselves. Somebody is, investing money in those teams and creating a system for them to be successful. And even within, an ideally designed enterprise level agile system, one of the things that we encourage at Leading Agile is you need to be able to measure the system, because that's how we know whether the system is working for us. Systems produce what they're designed to produce. And if your system isn't producing what it's supposed to based upon your metrics, then it's incumbent upon, the leader who designed that system to change the system. Yeah. So the implication of that is when you have multi-level systems that are created by individuals who are not, down at the team level, because you have nested concerns.
Sure.
They have a very real, not just right, but responsibility to understand how that's working so that they can be able to, be an effective leader.
And so the thing I was thinking about when you were talking was, if it was like an orchestra, right? And we were talking about a team that had full autonomy, my violin player or a violin player might decide for their own personal satisfaction or goodness or whatever, or their efficiency in playing, they're going to play at a certain tempo. But if the whole rest of the orchestra is playing at a different tempo, it's going to sound terrible.
Yeah.
So somebody's got to coordinate the efforts of all these groups. And in order to do that, you have to instrument the system so you can see how things are moving.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So that's where it does make sense to inhibit that Kanban team's ability to just design their own flow.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Okay. So can you walk through like what the larger organization gains in doing this and what they're losing or what they're giving up?
Yeah. And I mean, it's not anybody in the organization, like trying to be evil, right? They have people that they answer to, right? Yeah. I mean, CEOs have a board that they answer to. Managers have executives that they answer to that are, funding them and providing them with the capacity to go solve problems. So, as a manager or as a leader in a company, or even, as a shareholder of a company,
right?
What I'm gaining from balancing these concerns in this way is I gain a system that's cohesive, that now I can understand when it's working and when it's not.
Right.
I can understand when I'm getting results and when I'm not. And that empowers me to be able to make decisions that are informed and not just based off of, sticking my finger up in the wind,
right,
or based off of who's yelling the loudest, or, anything like that.
But you're not, you're looking at a larger sampling, right? You're not going to have any awareness down at the level we were talking about. If that team had full autonomy and they would know, like, this is the one thing, you're not necessarily going to see that at that higher level, because you're looking at a bunch of teams in aggregate to try to see where the thing's breaking down.
Well, yeah, you're generally looking in aggregate. You still want the ability to get signal down from the local level. You want that signal to be relevant signal, right? And not noise. So, if we have, significant evidence coming from, even down at the delivery team level, that something that we're building is, not actually helping us implement our strategy with our customers and markets, we need the ability to know that that's happening and change direction. And part of that is how you instrument the system. But, there's also some qualitative aspects to that too, where, if you have people that are, at a low level and they're realizing, hey, this thing isn't feasible, or this thing that we designed is, actually going to cause some runaway cost or something like that. Yeah, we've got to be able to raise our hand and get that up the stack.
Yeah. So do you think there are instances where it would make sense for basically the company to say, all right, all the Scrum teams, you're all going to follow this thing, but we're going to cut off all the Kanban teams. You're going to go do your own thing over there, and we'll look at you separately from the Scrum teams because we want you to have that. I mean, can you see where a company might decide to give them the level of autonomy they want? Maybe have a Jira admin for the Kanban teams and then one for the Scrum teams?
That would absolutely be a valid approach. It's just a trade-off that you're making there. Do you want to hire another admin and have them, or dedicate another admin to solving that internal problem within your organization? Is that, justifiable?
Okay.
Right. Or is it, well, we don't have enough Kanban teams. They're not really experiencing enough pain that makes it worth fixing it.
Yeah.
Right. So
not worth the squeeze.
And that, that happens. It may not be the best for those teams, but, part of being in a corporate environment is they make trade-offs. People are going to make trade-offs, and
somebody's got to be the pinky toe.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So one last question on this thing. It's really a two-part question though. If you are working with a company that's trying to understand performance of Scrum teams, let's say 50 Scrum teams in the entire company, what are the key metrics that you want to pay attention to? And then I have the same question about Kanban teams.
Well, some of that depends upon the conditions of your organization, but generally, when you're standing up a Scrum team, you want to look first to, are they predictable? Can they make and meet commitments?
Okay.
Right. And then once you have a stable, predictable system, you can start to do some things to try and alleviate some of the constraints in your system and increase your throughput, lower your cycle time. The whole Little's Law thing can work, as much for Scrum as it can for Kanban. Okay.
So, so then you would be looking at basically like flow metrics for both after you got to that make and meet commitments.
Yeah. Well, and you can accomplish the same thing with both. It's just going to look a little different and have different characteristics. I mean, you can have a predictable Kanban team if you're delivering, within a predictable set of SLAs that are aligned to your actual cycle times. That is as reliable as a Scrum team that commits to, a set of points every 2 weeks that's based upon, yesterday's weather.
Cool. All right. Any final words of advice for people that have been listening to this? Things you want companies to consider? Because I appreciate you talking about it. I just want them to think about these things before they make decisions about it.
Yeah. I mean, the big one is don't just go making reactionary changes to your tooling in your enterprise system. Change within those needs to be a part of an overall change strategy within your organization to take you where you're trying to go. So, I don't just want to go start, mucking up Jira or mucking up Rally, willy-nilly. I need to understand what my destination is so that I can begin to put together a path that's going to get us there at a pace of change that's appropriate for the organization and appropriate with the other systems changes that are going along to support it.
That's awesome. So I was kind of thinking the exact opposite of that. I was thinking I really want them to know if they go down the path like my client went down where they've defined these columns for the Kanban teams, like I want you to be super clear about what you're giving up. I know why you're doing what you're doing, but I want you to know what you're sacrificing to get that.
Yeah.
But they're probably both really important.
Well, yeah. I mean, and if you have local autonomy, like you've gotten permissions down to the team level.
Yeah.
Right. And you're looking at this more from a bottom up perspective, and you have the ability to, create your own permissions, create your own workflows, things like that. Yeah. You can experiment, right? You should experiment. You should, if you have the conditions for that in your company.
Yeah. Go ahead and do it.
Leverage it for your benefit, to be more responsive and adaptive, to be, to foster a higher sampling rate on your continuous improvement experiments, things like that.
Cool. Thank you, man. So what if people want to get in touch with you, like as a follow-up with questions? What's the best way to reach you?
So probably the easiest way is my my email, tom.furland@leadingagile.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out and connect.
Cool. All right. Thanks. I appreciate you making time for this and for helping me with my client.
Absolutely. Anytime, Dave.